Here. Thank you, Stuart, for this great opportunity and for taking the time to share your knowledge with us. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Amen.
All right. Would you like me to just start up, Michelle, or anything? Any other preferences there? Okay, cool. All right. Before I get started tonight, and before I get started on this whole series, thought I'd introduce myself first. I am going to be pretty attentive to time. I'm just kind of trained that way now, teaching my classes on Zoom. I also want to respect people's time. But if after this people want to stick around, ask questions, definitely want to be open to that, as well as if this can turn into other things. That this conversation tonight and this class, this 4-week class, could potentially turn into other classes, spin into other classes, just based on what our interests are. But what I wanted to start out with is just to let you know a little bit about me and how I'm going to be. Okay, where are these words coming from? Who is this person who's saying them, and why? And so tell you a little bit about me, tell you a little bit about the class, and then dive into it and try to cover 300 years of history in about 50 minutes. So my name is Stewart Davenport. I'm originally from Birmingham, Alabama, and if you know anything about the history of the Deep South and the Civil Rights Movement, Birmingham is absolutely central to that, has a pretty troubled racial past. That's where I grew up. So I've been thinking about these issues since I was a teenager, just walking around in that city and the kind of feeling the weight of that history. It impacted me. I was able to study in college and grad school with some people who are really absolute top-notch and scholars when it comes to American history and when it comes to race, in particular, African-American history. And so that kind of continued my education. And I've basically been thinking about this for a very long time, studying it. I've never written on it. And I've not written on it in part because I've just been pursuing other things. I'm also a historian of American religion. Race can be included in that, but the projects that I've taken on have not yet included race. So I've been doing other projects. I'm also a little terrified of it, to be completely honest. This is very sensitive stuff. I was just watching the news before class started, and if you were watching the news before 7 o'clock or when this is over and you turn on the news, you'll see that there's civil unrest in Louisville right now because of the Breonna Taylor verdict. So this gets to issues of race and policing and systems, entire systems. This is, turn me off right now, turn on the news, and you're going to see the legacy of this history in our present. We're all feeling this right now. So I am honored that Anne asked me to do this class. I'm glad that it's being recorded. I'm a little terrified of it being recorded, but I also want to do the best I can to contribute something to this conversation for our church and for anybody else who wants to hear it. But kind of what I was saying, so I'm a guy from Birmingham. I studied this in college. I haven't written on it, haven't spoken very much about it. Again, in part because I've been pursuing these other things. I'm a little terrified of it. But I teach on this. So I teach on this in the classroom, and I've been teaching this in the classroom for 18 years, and so at Pepperdine. So what you're going to be getting tonight is a kind of distillation of those classes in 4 one-hour sessions. So those are the reasons why I have not published on this. I'm not an authority on it, although I have been teaching it and thinking about it for a very long time. I think the other thing I wanted to say in terms of, by way of a preface, is regarding language. These are very sensitive subjects. Let me, related to kind of what I was just saying, let me tell you what I know and what I don't know. I know what I've been teaching, and I know what I got to study and learn in college and grad school, and as a professor, as I've supplemented my knowledge over the course of my career. I feel like I know this relatively well. I don't know everything for sure, but I feel like I know the subject of transatlantic slavery, racism in the United States. I feel like I know this reasonably well. What I do not know, and this is relevant for our present moment, I do not have experience. I'm a white man. Let me state the obvious here. I have experienced life as a white man in America. I do not know what it's like to be, well, I guess in a way we're all racially profiled when someone looks at us and sees our skin color and then makes assumptions about us. The assumptions that people have made about me is that everything's going to be okay because he's a white guy. And so you don't have to watch him carefully in a convenience store, or you don't have to pull him over when he's in a suburb that's predominantly white. You know, I've been treated well in this society as a result of an unfortunate racial system. So I know my history. If it's in a book, I've read it and I can absorb that material. I do not have this existential background. And I think that matters in talking about this. And I just want to acknowledge this, that there is a limit to what I know. But I want us as a part of this class to do our best to understand the perspective of people who have not experienced America in the way that we have, and where these systems come from. And I definitely want to take time at the end for discussion and feedback to hear from people. This is incredibly relevant. Again, turn me off, go and turn on the news right now, and you're going to see this. And it's very sensitive. So again, I'm thankful for this opportunity, and I want to steward this opportunity as best I can. Okay, excuse me. Tonight, we're going to talk about basically 1400 to 1700. What I said in the prompt that I wrote on this, or the description of this class, is it might seem like, why are we going back to the 1400s before we talk about the 21st century? Hopefully this will make sense. So, okay, I'm going to screen share now. By the way, I tell this to my students. My strength as a professor is as a storyteller. I believe stories are actually incredibly important, and you don't need technology to do that. You just need to be able to speak and someone to be able to listen to you, and hopefully you can both spin a good yarn and express things in a way that sticks without bells and whistles or any visual aids. That's my strength. My weakness is technology, and you might see that tonight in the visuals that I'm going to share with you. So, okay, I think. Okay, can you see that quote?
No.
No.
No, okay. Okay, let me try to redo this. Can you see that?
Nothing new, just your picture in the group.
Okay, let me try again. Does anybody know why this is not working?
Are you the host of the meeting, Stuart?
No, I'm not.
Because I see that the host has disabled sharing.
Oh. He's a co-host though.
He is a co-host, so okay.
Yeah.
So what happens when you hit share screen? Do you see share screen?
It shows up as slides, as virtual background, music computer.
No, it's asking you to choose. You can either share your whole computer or you can choose one window to be shared. So
Should I go to basic, advanced, or files?
What?
It up here, it says basic, advanced, or files.
I think basic.
Okay, under basic, there's nothing. There's not an option.
All right, what's under advanced? I don't get that choice.
Slides is virtual background, music, or content from second camera.
Boy, this is really weird.
Let me, I think,
Slides.
I think I found something here.
Ooh. Something's starting.
We are now supposedly viewing your screen, but there it is.
Oh,
Yeah,
there's
there.
quote.
Okay, well, I feel like I'm in A Clockwork Orange or something right now. That's a very weird reference. Okay, I just thought I'd include this quote here. I include that for my students. Okay, next slide. Here's where I really want to start.
Stuart, can you read the quote, please? It's cut off on my screen.
Sure. In times of change and danger, when there's a quicksand of fear under men's reasoning, a sense of continuity with generations gone before can stretch like a lifeline across the scary present. That's from John Dos Passos.
Thank you.
Sure. I think we are in kind of strange times and fearful times for sure. I definitely take comfort in my faith and also take comfort from the fact that people have been through bad things before. It gives me some measure of sense that we can get through this as well. Okay, do you see the map of Europe?
Yes.
Okay, here's the whole point for wanting to bring up this map of Europe. It's to say, and the theme of this lecture, the theme of this class is power. Just plain and simple power and a certain form of tribalism. And tribalism can be defined in all different kinds of ways, large ways, small ways. You can kind of identify a group as just a dozen people against another dozen people or entire nations. The tribalism that I want to start out with in this class is actually the conflict between Christianity and Islam, which took place over hundreds of years in the Middle Ages. I'm not going to say a whole heck of a lot about that, just to say regarding power, we think of Europe. I'm going to indulge in a little bit of, I don't want to just universalize for myself, but generally people think of Europe as wealthy, civilized, sophisticated, completely having its act together, having all of these great institutions, having plenty of wars, for sure. Let's rewind the clock 600 years and take us to the year 1400. Europe is a backwater. Europe is, if you're going to speak in terms of inferiority and superiority, Europe is inferior to the civilization of Islamic countries. Europe did not have as advanced mathematics, technology, in some cases systems of laws. And in addition to that, Islamic civilizations, Christian civilizations were expansionist as well. They clash in the Crusades. Obviously, Christians did horrible things. Muslims did horrible things. It's completely blood-soaked. But Muslims were invading into Europe in a way that Europeans were positively terrified by. And so if we were to rewind the clock back to 1400, Muslims were in the Iberian Peninsula and had been in the Iberian Peninsula for hundreds of years. Muslims were about to take the city of Constantinople in 1453. This was the bastion of the Eastern Roman Empire, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. When it fell, it seemed like Western civilization, European civilization is falling apart. This is all, so there's things going on before 1453 and after, but that's all part of the same process of Europeans are nervous about this. What Muslims have, Islamic civilization stretching into the Middle East and further, all these access to trade routes, all these access, also kind of reaching down from Northern Africa into Sub-Saharan Africa and gaining tremendous resources from that. I'm saying all of this to say Europe, which is pinched up into this corner of the continent of Eurasia, and now feels kind of claustrophobic and hemmed in by Muslims. I don't know what the best way is to say that. I don't want to be offensive. Starts exploring the Atlantic, starts getting out into the Atlantic to bypass the Mediterranean. And unsurprisingly, there's honestly a kind of geographical almost determinism about this. I don't really mean that, but that's a very loaded word for a historian to use, deterministic. But you see a certain logic about this. The first nation to get out into the Atlantic and start exploring is Portugal. Why? Because Portugal faces the Atlantic. It does not touch the Mediterranean. It was in some cases, it was barred from entering the Mediterranean and trading within the Mediterranean, whereas Spain could. And so the Portuguese, they'd also kicked out all of the Muslims from the country in the 1200s. So they had an opportunity to get out and start exploring. And they do that. Okay, now I want to change the screen share. This. Okay, I want to stop this screen share and start another one. I think this thing is messing up on me. I'm sorry about that. Okay, let me just, all right. Okay, stop the screen share. Let me try this other one. I don't know why it's not giving me the opportunity. I'm trying to bring something up that I don't know if it is a, try this again. Can anybody help me out on this?
Are you back in the list of tabs, basic, advanced, and files?
Yeah.
Okay, and it's just not showing up?
It's not showing up. The only thing that shows up as an option under advanced is slides as virtual background, music, and content from second camera.
Ah, okay.
Under files, under basic, I get nothing.
So to clarify, is the file that you want to share, is it open elsewhere on your computer?
Not now, I closed it down.
Okay.
But usually when I go to basic, it gives me options of share my screen.
Yeah.
It's not giving me that. It's not giving me the option, so I don't know what to do without the option.
I would try to reopen that file if you can, and then see if it to see if it enters into that basic section.
Okay, I've opened it. Okay, can you see that?
We see your list of files now. So it is showing us something.
I think we're seeing your screen, your desktop, I think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So just open something and see if we, yeah.
Can you see that?
And well, I think now you'll have to go back into share screen and share that specific image or that file. So you'll have to open the file and.
Okay, got it. Got it. Can you see that?
Yes.
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 Yep.
Okay. Okay. This is why I don't like technology.
It's a big learning curve. Same here.
All right. Okay. Taking all that I just said, and this is really just so I did all that work to show you this really fantastic map and all of this living color here. Okay, and it's to say this. Again, talking about power and the clash of powers between Christian civilization and Islamic civilization. Notice the date on this map, 8th to the 11th centuries, and the title of this map is The Slave Trade. It's in black and white. You have to look at it and squint. Okay, what is the Mediterranean? What is the continent? What is it? What are we? You have to orient yourself here. The thing that I want to draw your attention to the most about this map is the fact that these arrows that indicate the direction of movement of enslaved people begins in the Slavic lands. Not all arrows do, but 3 major arrows begin in the Slavic lands. Look at over here what's going on in England and Ireland. The English and the Irish were enslaving each other like crazy. Muslims were enslaving Christians. Christians were enslaving Muslims. Both were enslaving pagans. Slavery was a common institution at the time. It's been around for as long as civilization has been around. And 1,000 years ago, ironically, or fittingly, or however you want to put it, it was Africans in places like Alexandria who were enslaving Europeans, and especially people from the Slavic lands. This is where we get our word slave. And Slavs, last time I checked, are white. So this is an instance of, again, Africans enslaving Europeans. Power, however, shifted, and that's the rest of the story. Okay, this map, again, in fantastic color here for you, is Africa, sorry, got cut off a little bit, trade routes and trade centers from 1100 to 1600. Here's what I want to point out about this. We all know what the Sahara Desert is. So here's the Sahara Desert. Here are these very long lines going from Northern Africa. These are the caravan routes. These caravans going hundreds and perhaps thousands of miles from Northern Africa to Sub-Saharan Africa. These Northern African nations engaged in trade with Sub-Saharan nations, and they also engaged in the slave trade. So, and please don't think that I'm blaming everything on Muslims or making Muslims into the bad guys or something. I'm just saying Muslims had the power back then, and they used that power to enslave people, and Christians did too when they had the power. But the point that I want to make about this is that because of the long-standing warfare and animosity between Christians and Muslims in Europe and around the Mediterranean, Christians did not want to start a war with Muslims over enslavement. Muslims did not want to start a war with Christians over enslavement. So when the Portuguese got out into the Atlantic, and one of the major things that they discovered, this is Prince Henry the Navigator. I looked him up again a couple nights ago. This is the kind of awesomely nerdy things that I do at 8 o'clock at night. Hey, I think I'll look up Prince Henry the Navigator. One thing that was really interesting to me that I learned about this is he was in part motivated because Portugal was being raided by North African, from raiders from North African cities. I don't know if they were Muslim or not, but okay, we've got to fight them, and we have to get better at this whole navigation thing and building ships, and that's what he did. One of the major discoveries of Prince Henry the Navigator and that era was the discovery of these trade winds, that they go in this clockwise direction. And why this matters is the Portuguese were able to sail down the coast of Africa for the first time and get back. That was the big terror. And the whole idea that the world is flat and you'll fall off the end of it, that was all bogus. But the sense of if you go down here, you really can't get back because they didn't have the navigational tools to do so. Okay, why am I saying all of this? The Portuguese get down further down the coast of Africa. They get to Sub-Saharan Africa. Here, this line here is technically where the Sahara Desert ends. This is the northern, key on the map says this, northern boundary of the forest. So Muslims had been enslaving Sub-Saharan Africans for hundreds of years. Africans had been enslaving other Africans for as long as anybody could remember. When the Portuguese, these Europeans, get down here and start raiding into the African interior and grabbing people and forcing them into slavery, primarily for all kinds of things, but the main thing was sugar. If you want to know the single crop, the single commodity that links one hemisphere with the other in terms of human misery, is this crop, sugar cane. People could not get enough of it, and it was grown almost exclusively with enslaved labor. Okay, so the whole reason why I'm going into this story is this class is about encounters. This class is about racism. This class is about people who look different, look from one another, living with one another, encountering one another, having various relationships with one another, sometimes with a tremendous power disparity, the ultimate power disparity. When the Portuguese, these Europeans who look European, get down to Africa, what happens? There's a for a long time, there's been a debate, the kind of slavery race debate. It's a kind of a chicken and egg debate. I know what side I'm on in this debate. I don't actually see it so much as a chicken and egg thing. I see it more as kind of causal. I let my students answer this question whichever way they want. I don't grade them for agreeing with me or not agreeing with me. But I'm definitely on the side of slavery leads to race. Slavery leads to these racialized systems. People look different in Africa than from people in Europe, but follow with me in this kind of thought experiment that I'm going to engage in. What if race didn't exist? What if everyone in the world were Black? And so kind of take the mental images that you have of, okay, the picture that you've seen, the painting of Christopher Columbus, Henry VIII, all the popes, substitute a Black person for that. Everyone in Asia is Black, everyone in North and South America is Black. It's a fantasy question. This is what historians call a counterfactual. We kind of don't like them, me too, but this is just an interesting kind of thought experiment. Again, that race never happened. If the Portuguese were Black and got down to Sub-Saharan Africa, I think they would have enslaved people every bit as much as they enslaved people who looked different from them. I don't think that race was causal in this. I think the need for labor was causal. And the fact that the peoples of Sub-Saharan Africa looked different was a contributing factor for things that will accelerate in the future in terms of, hey, they look different, now let's put all of this meaning onto the fact that these people look different from us. In terms of power, as the Portuguese get down here, there's this interesting shift that takes place at first. And again, they kind of wanted to make sure not to enslave Muslims because then that could initiate retaliation from other Muslim countries and powers, and they could reap the whirlwind for that. So at first the Portuguese raided into the interior and kidnapped people and grabbed them, and those people fought back. And they oftentimes killed the Portuguese. So that's a way to lose your men very fast in these slave trading enterprise. What the Portuguese started to do was meet with and intentionally seek out the most powerful African kingdoms that they could to then work with them basically in a trade arrangement. You have something to sell us that we want, and that's enslaved Africans. And this is sadly true of basically human experience. People have enemies. The Christian commandment, love your neighbor, it's a good one, and it's a necessary one, because usually people hate their neighbors and go to war with their neighbors. And that was true in Africa every bit as much of it as it was true in Europe. So these powerful, one of the most powerful kingdoms was the Kingdom of Congo. Here it is. It shows up on this map here. By the way, just yesterday, to kind of, like I said, I've been teaching this for a very long time, but I just kind of refreshed a little bit watching this very good documentary that you can find. Clearly technology is not my thing. I barely understand my television, but I know if I go to my certain feeds and just type in the name of something, it might show up. There's a really good documentary called Africa's Great Civilizations, and it's hosted by Henry Louis Gates. Very, very good. And I watched an episode of that yesterday just to kind of brush up on this again. The episode about slavery in particular talks a lot about the Congo and how powerful the Kingdom of the Congo was, and how the Portuguese then dealt with the Kingdom of the Congo. And the Kingdom of the Congo then went out, it was having plenty of wars already, and then that's where slavery comes from, being a loser in a war. And that's true of Africans, that's true of, again, of what was going on in Europe at the time. But here's a crucial point in this. The Portuguese, as they go down and start dealing with these kingdoms, they bow and scrape and go through all of the same diplomatic motions as they would in the Kingdom of France. If they were going to some other European kingdom, race did not matter in that. Power mattered in that. And in many ways, the Portuguese, hundreds or thousands of miles from home in territory that they're not familiar with, and needing the help of these African kingdoms, are the less powerful ones. They are going to bow, they're going to scrape, they're going to negotiate. But just to point out, they did not necessarily have at the time, they might have thought, bad things and written bad things in their diaries or something like that about what Africans look like and sound like and what their food's like and that kind of thing. But they still had to deal with these African tribes with respect because of their power. Okay, what I want to try to do for the remaining 20 minutes or so is talk about a couple of themes here, moving chronologically forward in time. So the first of those is the encounter, the initial encounter. And again, what I want to say about this, I'm more on the side of the institution of slavery. So if we think in terms of racial stereotypes, and these racial stereotypes that we've been living with in the United States for a very long time, those racial stereotypes are a historical creation. And in terms of Europeans thinking of Africans as inferior, either in terms of their civilization or their biology or whatever, in whatever way they were thinking in terms of superior and inferior, they did not act on that. In these encounters, again, they met as equals. Europeans and Africans meeting as equals to engage in trade. But this is not the experience of people on the other side of the Atlantic, as the institution of slavery becomes a transatlantic phenomenon. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about are these encounters and this kind of dynamic, which came first, slavery or racism? And that's really the better way to put it, which came first, slavery or racism? The next thing I want to talk about is what happened in Africa, as what is the process of enslavement, and then what's going on the other side of the Atlantic in the Americas. Okay, so let me stick with this here, this map of Africa. Actually, I'll go to this one. I use this in my class to make a very simple point that is maybe you've thought of before, maybe not. Excuse me. Africa is gigantic. It is an absolutely enormous continent. you can fit the continental United States of America into the continent of Africa 3.5 times. That's just how gargantuan Africa is. Okay, in the continent of Africa, and in particular in this region of Western Africa, the estimate of the amount of people enslaved is anywhere between 10 million, and what I saw in this documentary yesterday with Henry Louis Gates is 12 million, 12.5 million. Records on this are very kind of difficult to get precise, to get precision on, so the figures are constantly revised. But basically 10 million to 12.5 million. In class, I show a clip from this Steven Spielberg movie Amistad. It's a fantastic movie. It's a fantastic clip. It's only about 10 minutes. At most, it's 10 minutes, and it shows the process of enslavement. Of an African man being kidnapped, a net thrown over his head, dragged out somewhere else, beaten into unconsciousness so he won't scream and yell and cause a fuss. All of this is being done by other Africans. Then the enslaved Africans are brought to the coast. That's actually a historical process that was called coasting, where they would just store up enough of them to make for a shipload that would then go across the Atlantic. By the way, I kind of hinted at this at the beginning of class, and I don't think I finished my thought on it. I said the language that we use in this, we have to be careful about, and I mean that. There's a weird way, I almost feel, when I teach on this, I almost feel like a cancer doctor or something, that like, okay, my job is to constantly tell, I mean, sometimes good news to patients, but how many times do I have to tell bad news to people? And one can get kind of desensitized to the horror of what you're talking about and the pain of what you're talking about. So there can be insensitivities in the way that I speak that come from my own background, ways in which I'm not completely up to date on changes in language that might have happened, and also a kind of, I don't want to say callousness, but a kind of just clinicalness that one has to adopt in talking about this. But I hope that in doing so, that never minimizes the human pain of it. So if I talk in these very kind of calculated, cold economic terms, that's something that kind of goes with the territory, although it's gross. It's just gross. But I want you to know that I recognize that. Okay. So 10 to 12.5 million people kidnapped in Africa. And again, this clip, it then shows the Africans who did the enslaving being rewarded with firearms, and that was the whole deal. Powerful kingdoms then became even more powerful because the Europeans shared their weaponry with them, which a lot of African countries didn't have access to. So all the more power to places like the Kingdom of the Congo. Okay, in this map here, main source of African slaves, 1500 to 1800, it shows where enslaved people came from in Western Africa. Where they went to, this is what I want us to talk about next. Let me just use this map. Okay, since we are all good Episcopalians, we know a little bit about English history. We know, okay, there's a little bit of a quiz involved here, just to make sure y'all are paying attention. The Civil War was between the English kind of Puritan parliamentarians and the Royalists. They behead Charles I. The English chop. I don't know why I smile when I talk about this, but historians get a dark sense of humor, and I have one as well. So here I am laughing about a regicidal decapitation, which took place in 1649. It didn't work out well at all. The Commonwealth after that did not work out well at all. So in 1660, we have what's called the restoration of the monarchy. And that is Charles I's son, Charles II, who was very happy to have his head on his shoulders and very happy to be king. Okay, let's pretend it's 1660 and you are Charles II and you're not just surveying England, but you're surveying your empire, the English Empire. You've just, arrived on the throne. What is the most valuable piece of real estate in your entire English Empire? Like as king, an absolute moneymaker for you and your future realm is what from the English Empire? You got New England, you got Boston, you got the Chesapeake, you got South Carolina, you got some islands in the Caribbean. Anybody want to take a guess on this? You're King Charles II, and how are things going in this colony? Because you really want it to be prospering and doing well, and because it can prosper and do very well for you.
I guess the West Indies because of the sugar trade.
That's exactly right. Okay, it's this teeny tiny island right here. So here you see the words Lesser Antilles, almost like a period to that word. Is that right there is the island of Barbados. The most valuable piece of real estate in the entire English Empire in the year 1660 is this speck of dirt in the Caribbean. No offense to Barbados and Barbadians, but it's this teeny tiny little island. Boston, New Englanders, Plymouth, who cares? Virginia, yeah, they're growing some tobacco. Things seem to be going reasonably well there. This is our moneymaker. And it's our moneymaker because of the sugar trade and enslaved labor. This is one of the most interesting things I've learned in my entire study of history. Barbados, because it is removed from from the main archipelago of the Lesser Antilles, it's separated from them by about 150 miles. It was kind of out of sight, out of mind. So the various nations of Europe did not compete for it. What would happen is a European country, we want that island, you go and you take it, then you get a little soft, and another country comes in with an even larger invasion force and takes the island from you, and that happens over and over and over again. Lucy called this the West Indies. Just in case you don't know, the West Indies and the Caribbean is the same. We call it today the Caribbean, they called it back then the West Indies. But this island of Barbados is the absolute moneymaker because of the sugar that's grown there. Also, being 150 miles closer to Africa made it a dumping ground for the African slave trade. So they were full of enslaved peoples to work the land, who were then resold throughout the Caribbean and into the Americas. Okay, I mention this because this is an often forgotten part of this story. If I can't assume this with my students because I have international students. So I have plenty of students who didn't grow up in America and go through the American educational system where they learned the 50 states and they learned the American Revolution and stuff like that. I can't assume that as a teacher. I can perhaps assume that a little bit more with you. If you are American, if you grew up in this country, you kind of have stamped into you this continental understanding of the country. Here, Maine kind of sticks up, Florida is a peninsula, and then you got Texas, and you got the West Coast, California, et cetera. You don't really think about the West Indies. You don't think about the Caribbean. This was the heart of the Atlantic world for all of these European countries. And when I was talking at the beginning about, hey, Portugal, in order to protect itself against Muslims, but also against other European countries, there's this intense competition. This is true everywhere. I was just talking about how in Africa, powerful kingdoms like the Kingdom of the Congo enslaved people from weaker kingdoms around it. This happened with the Aztecs in Mexico. This is also going on in Europe. This is a certain gross realpolitik. Honestly, since I'm teaching this class as a part of a church, and Pepperdine's a Christian school, so I can kind of speak religiously every now and then, but this is not witchcraft spectral evidence or something like that I'm about to give you. There really is a sad horror in the way that human beings treat one another, of a certain form of tribalism that I don't know if it's ingrained in us, but there's plenty of historical evidence to defend this claim, which is rather than loving your neighbor, the rule pretty much seems to be you hate your neighbor. You compete with your neighbor. You might steal your neighbor's resources. You're threatened by your neighbor. What I think is fantastic about Christianity is we're supposed to do the opposite. We're supposed to undo tribalism. We're supposed to love our neighbor. This is not always difficult in a world like this. Both the world we have today, and it's kind of the world we've always had. It's just being brought to our attention in more dramatic fashion. Okay, so here, everything that I just said about these Caribbean islands, these West Indian islands. On the island of Barbados, it's unbelievably valuable. The island of Jamaica was acquired by the British as well. That's where the Barbadians went when they ran out of land on Barbados to grow more sugar cane. Okay, there's a thought that I want to finish up here, and then I want to move on to something else. Move on to the final point. Oops. Okay, so I focused in on just the Western Hemisphere, kind of focusing in particular on the Caribbean and talking about Barbados and the English. I do not want to give the English special attention here. I'm doing that because the United States of America is obviously more culturally and historically connected to England, but it's important to point out how England was a part of a much larger Atlantic system that involved all of these nations of Europe. I started with the Portuguese. I really haven't said anything about the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch. But all of these nations of Western Europe, that's why I started out with that map of Western Europe. I'm not going to try to bring it up because the technology is probably going to collapse on me here. But just think of the nations of Western Europe. They saw what Portugal did, because Portugal in a way had to, because it didn't have access to the Mediterranean. And then Christopher Columbus, then the Spanish. And then the French get involved on the game, the English get involved on the game, and the Dutch get involved. These are all the nations of Western Europe. And they start colonizing to enrich themselves, to protect themselves against their neighbors. If the French ever invade the Dutch, so you got to be ready for that. If they ever invade the Spanish, you have to be ready for that, etc. So enrich yourselves using the resources of the Americas, which could be gotten simply by extraction, if it's gold and silver, or if it's a crop that can grow only in a place that's more tropical. You can't really grow tobacco in England. You can in Virginia, and you can't really grow sugar in England, but you can on your plantations. This makes you fantastically wealthy, and it also gives you something that you like, that you didn't have before: sugar, tobacco, etc. Okay, I only have about 8 minutes, so I want to do this part quickly. I like this map. Again, here it is in vibrant color for you, black and white and gray. But I like this in particular because of the fatness or the skinniness of these arrows. If I'm just going to, this is kind of gross and bad, but I'm going to kind of stick with the number of 10 million enslaved Africans because it's easier for me to do the math. The number, again, could potentially be as high as 12.5 million Africans. But what I say to students, and what I'll say to you as well, 50% of those enslaved Africans were taken to the Caribbean. That's why this arrow is the kind of biggest and fattest. But these islands of the Caribbean are owned by all different European nations: England, the Netherlands, France, Portugal, Spain. So the enslaved Africans end up on plantations in the Caribbean, but the people running those plantations are all of these nations of Western Europe. It's not one country that is to blame for this. It's all of them. The next 33% represented by this arrow go to Brazil. The middle passage, the trip across the Atlantic, was roughly a month from West Africa to Brazil. It's more like 2 months to go from West Africa to the Caribbean. This lowered prices. And this here's the equator. Brazil grows fantastic sugar. It was a Portuguese colony. So 33%, or 3.3 million enslaved Africans, go to Brazil. These next 3 arrows here, which are pretty skinny, this is the Spanish Main. That accounts for another 10% of enslaved Africans. And then this teeny tiny, and this is the point of this teeny tiny little arrow, the skinniest arrow of all, goes to the future United States of America. Okay, I'm not saying this in any way to excuse America, to get America off the hook, to say, look, everybody was doing it and America's not so bad or something like that. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is I want to put the United States and the American colonies and the future United States of America into this larger context. I'm from the American South. We often think of the South as being exceptional, and in some ways it was. And honestly, that has to do with geography. That has to do with the climate. I picked up this right here in South Pasadena, one of these little lending library things that stand out. You know, you can just leave your leftover books there and pick up new books. Picked up a book there on the weather. I was like, okay, cool. It's just kind of a children's book on the weather, but it had all of the zones throughout the country. This is a whatever zone, that's a whatever zone. The tropical zone, it definitely included Brazil and the Caribbean. It also included the United States South. It went up into exactly where I grew up, Alabama, and these other states. Why I'm saying this is the land, the climate, the geography was basically primed for plantation agriculture that had been established in places like the Caribbean. Okay, I wanted to just give you a very brief and kind of thumbnail, or kind of paint with broad brushes, however you want to say it, sense, okay, here's why transatlantic slavery happened. Here's what that initial encounter was like. Here's what's going on in West Africa as best I can explain it. Here's the Middle Passage on that, and here's what happens. Here's where the enslaved people went with these percentages: 50%, 33%, 10%, and the remaining 6 or 7% go to the United States. I only have about 4 minutes left. What I want to talk about next is what happens in the future United States of America, and let me take a kind of a poll on this. I only have 4 minutes. Would you rather me talk about this now and us go until 10 minutes after 8, or should I just start here on next week?
10 minutes after 8.
10 minutes after 8.
Okay, cool. All right, I'll finish up my thoughts about this then. Okay, here's what happens in the future United States of America. And I'll tell this as a tale of 2 colonies. And one of those colonies is Virginia. One of those colonies is South Carolina. Actually, let me see. I've probably got a better map of it here. Actually, here's a good one. Okay, this map says slave population 1820 to 1860. We are very, very far away from that. But I'm going to use this just because what it shows is slave population 1820 to 1860. This part was not America yet in 1600. Only so Europeans were clinging to the East Coast in places like Virginia and Massachusetts and stuff. Okay, so the 2 colonies that I want to talk about, Virginia and South Carolina. Here is a absolutely huge difference between them. I wish that I could spin this out into a longer story because it's a really, really, really interesting and important story. But I'll just kind of give it to you as best I can in bullet points here. Here I think is the best, shortest way to put this. South Carolina started out as a slave colony from the beginning, day one. In the 1670s, I believe, it's named, Carolina is like the Carolingian period. It's named after Charlemagne. Carolina is named after King Charles, in this case, Charles II. There's an interesting connection to the Caribbean that I'll talk about in just a minute. South Carolina started out as a slave colony from day one. Actually, let me just make this point now. Okay. Here's the story of South Carolina. The land on Barbados ran out. The Europeans who went to Barbados, who gobbled up all the good land, all the best land to grow sugar on, then the land was gone. They, however, in doing that, copied the Portuguese and other European plantations. Again, everybody's kind of in on this. The English are not particularly horrible. But then they mastered this technique and they got the blueprint for a sugar plantation down to a T on the island of Barbados. Then the land runs out. they take with them that blueprint in their head along with slaves to places like Jamaica and replicate what had been perfected in Barbados. Then when the land in Jamaica runs out, they go to the Carolinas. This really should fundamentally change your understanding of American history. It did mine. This one sentence that I'm about to say. South Carolina is not a colony of England. South Carolina is a colony of Barbados. And what I mean by that is, yes, the white people who arrived in South Carolina are of English background. They're speaking the English language with an English accent, and they toast the king and all that good stuff. But where they had come from more recently and had lived there for years, if not decades, and been enculturated and stamped by that slave system is the island of Barbados and Jamaica. The English colonial model, or the model plantation island in the English Empire, was established on those islands and then shared with the American mainland. I see this as a tragedy. Again, I don't know what could be done about the fact that the land was so, the climate was so tropical and the conditions perfect for growing crops that end up being grown well with plantation systems and enslaved labor. I don't know what really could be done about that. But the way I often describe this in class is slavery is like cancer. There are forms of slavery that are unbelievably brutal. They're just complete death sentences, in the same way that some diagnoses of cancer, you don't have a lot of time. Then there are other forms of cancer that are treatable and not nearly as horrible, but no one ever says, I got the good kind of cancer. There is no good kind of cancer. There is no good form of slavery. This cancer that really is centered in the Caribbean spreads to this body of what is going to be the future United States of America, and later metastasizes. And the important point that I please make sure that you hear me clearly on this. I don't want to be misinterpreted as saying that the spread of Black people is the cancer. I'm not saying that. I'm saying the institution of slavery is a cancer that has disastrous consequences on all the people around it, Black and white. And it gets this toehold in places like South Carolina. Again, the model for how are we going to structure our society doesn't come from let's imitate England when people got off the boat in South Carolina with their slaves. It came from Barbados. So day one, let's get this thing going and let's make money. What grows well in South Carolina turns out to be rice and not sugarcane. I just saw this on the news literally an hour ago. If you've ever wondered, these are racial stereotypes, and I'm not perpetuating them, I'm just talking about them. And these things are being taken down now, and rightly so. Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's rice. I just saw on the news an hour ago, Uncle Ben's rice is changing his name. The legacy of this history was on the news an hour ago, and it's going to be on the news when you turn me off and maybe go turn on the TV. Aunt and uncle are these terms that were used for enslaved people, and in South Carolina, in the Sea Islands of South Carolina, rice grows very well there. I could say more about that. But again, the main major point that I want to make about this is South Carolina, and really where I'm from too, Alabama, Georgia, this all spreads. The model that gets replicated in South Carolina that originated in Barbados then spreads throughout the Deep South. We're not there yet in this story, but we're going to get there. Virginia is a different story because, and this is hugely important, Virginia transitions to becoming a slave colony. Okay, because we are focused on the present in this class, explicitly focused on the present. Let me go back to this just a second here. Okay, here's this Barbados. There's teeny tiny little Barbados. Barbados very quickly, because it's an island, because sugar grew so well there, it just became a factory. This is agribusiness. This is a certain form of agribusiness. This is not a small family farm. These are gangs of laborers being lashed into doing their jobs, the jobs that the English plantation owners want them to be doing, harvesting the sugar cane. The life expectancy of an average field slave in Barbados was 3 years. You're kidnapped in Africa, you're taken to Barbados, you work and you die, and you're replaced. This is the engine of the English Empire in the 1600s. It is built on the bodies of these enslaved sugar plantation workers. Because these plantations were so large, because life is clearly miserable, there's no hope. There were plenty of rebellions, uprisings, violence. The white people on those islands are armed to the teeth. They are terrified, and they have a reason to be terrified. I'm not joining them in that, but yeah, if you're running a slave plantation, you are brutal. If you're running a slave plantation on Barbados, you are brutal. So there's an absolute brutality to the way whites treat blacks in places like that. That system gets transplanted to the future United States of America, to see black people as people who need to be controlled, to see black people as people who need to be feared. I'm not kidding about this. These dots connect. These dots connect over the course of hundreds of years. Okay, that's the way that white people were treating black people in places like Barbados when the system there got established relatively quickly. Okay, so I was talking about how whites were treating blacks. Let me talk here about how whites were treating whites. I'll do this as quickly as I can. Pardon me that I'm bumping up against the time here. There's this really important thing in Virginia history called Bacon's Rebellion. I think some of you, when I spoke about this in 2018, the people working the tobacco fields of Virginia, at first when they finally figured out, okay, tobacco's our moneymaker for sure, but we need a lot of labor to do it. Yes, there's this thing that you might have heard of called the 1619 Project. The first enslaved Africans were taken to the future United States of America, the colony of Virginia, Jamestown in particular, in the year 1619. There really were not a lot of enslaved Africans in Virginia until the very end of the century. Yes, enslaved people were brought in 1619 and others, but again, very small minority of the population. And that's actually an important, I'm not meaning to undermine the 1619 Project or minimize the enslaved people's lives in the early parts of the 1600s, but it was the minority. And what matters is that it's indentured servants, desperately poor English people who have nothing. I mean, there were these enclosure laws in England, and then that forced poor people off the land and into cities, and then down to docks. Like, they had nothing. So desperately poor English people who would sell themselves into servitude for 6 or 7 years, and then hope to get freedom and land when that was all over. There's an interesting story here. In the next class, I can tell it in greater detail if you're interested in it. But this whole system falls apart. And this entire system falls apart because the land starts to run out, exactly like it did in Barbados. And so these white people, these recently freed indentured servants who said, hey, I thought I put in my time, I worked for 7 years, now I want my land too. Where's my land? And there's a long story to this, but short version, they are super pissed off. They rebel against the colonial government and burn Jamestown to the ground. It all falls apart and they restore order later. But then after this, and here's the entire point of the story, the wealthy whites who had previously kept their distance from the poor whites because, hey, we're not like you. It was a rigid English class system replicated in Virginia. Now those people start shifting to enslaved labor. That's the transition from indentured servitude, Virginia not being initially a slave colony, which South Carolina was, to becoming a slave colony. And this has disastrous effects for blacks, obviously. But the important thing to notice about this, and this is honestly hugely important for understanding American society today, is the status boost that whites experience by being brought into the good graces of the wealthy Virginia planters. And why they're brought into the good graces of the wealthy Virginia planters is because now, whereas before, hey, you're our labor, and once your indentured's up, we just don't really want to see you anymore. Now, hey, we need you, poor white trash, to help us enforce this system of slavery, because if the slaves ever go crazy on us, and we're pretty sure they're going to because they're enslaved, and who wouldn't, we need your muscle, poor white guy, and your gun. Really, really important in this, to help us squash any slave rebellion. So you're a part of the team. You're in the tribe. This is a certain formation of white tribalism. Class differences are muted and racial differences are heightened to maintain a system of labor. Should the laborers in that system ever want to rebel against that system. Okay, that's all I got. Let me stop the share here. Does anybody want to ask any questions? I can kind of start, and Michelle and Gethin, y'all tell me, when to shut up, and okay, that's enough, Stuart, or whatever. But
Michelle's logged off to go start Compline, so if anybody wants to jump over to Compline, she's actually already started it up there. So, does anybody have a brief question that they'd like to ask?
Yeah, go ahead. I can. Terry? Yeah, and you're muted, unfortunately.
Okay. My question is, how was there any difference in the way white indentured servants were treated by the plantation owners versus the black slaves that came later to do the same kind of work?
Really, really good question. And it depends a little bit when you're, so let's just take the century of the 1600s. And one thing to say that is important to point out, indentured servants were not treated well. There was not a, hey, I'm a wealthy English person and you're an English person too, but you're dirt poor, let's hang out together. They were treated like dirt, barely fed, fed enough to survive, not really cared about. And most at the beginning didn't live through their term of service. Mm-hmm. So it was a great investment for the people who invested in them. They don't have to get anything at the end because they're dead. You do this work and then you're supposed to get this either land or some kind of freedom due at the end. Well, if you die before it's over, you don't get it. And life expectancy was very low at the beginning. So they were pretty miserably treated. Slaves were clearly miserably treated. Yeah. There are differences in the laws. And so for the same crime, let's say it's stealing a pig or hitting somebody or something like that, that black people would be punished more severely than white people. Absolutely. And then later, as the system hardened and got worse, I actually have a quote here. Maybe I can read a quote for you. If not, I can just kind of convey the point, I think, with summarizing it. When I talked about, so before Bacon's Rebellion, like if I'm a rich English person, I keep those poor English people away from me. I don't want them marrying my daughter, really being on my property unless they're working on it, that kind of thing. After that, I need them. I need their muscle, I need their gun, and I need their vote. The franchise was expanded to again kind of boost the status of poor whites in a number of ways. A part of the laws that changed after this, there are these, I could look for this, but the general gist of it is, and that this is hugely important for what we're dealing with in American society right now. The laws were written for the benefit of white people, to the detriment of black people. actually, let me just find this to read it, because I think it will convey the point, and it's told very efficiently and very well. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit from this book. It's called Colonial America by this, like, absolutely one of the best historians around, Alan Taylor. Okay, this is after Bacon's Rebellion. New laws restricted the movement and trading by slaves. In other words, what slaves could do, the movement and trading that slaves could do. None could leave a plantation without a written pass from the master. Militia squads patrolled the roads. These militia squads are made up exclusively of these poor whites, to demand passes, to inspect slave quarters for weapons, and to break up gatherings of visiting blacks. This is a certain militarization, watch the news right now, militarization that goes on to boost white people into the role of the guards.
Mhm.
I think of slavery in the American South in particular, again, I'm from there, as a gigantic prison system,
Mhm.
where you can tell the difference between the prisoners and the guards. They don't need uniforms, they have skin color.
Mhm.
That is the role that race played. And in addition to okay, if you're black, you must be enslaved. Why? And poor white trash, who before didn't have anything, now have this status boost of, I help enforce this system, and I feel better about myself because I'm connected to wealth and power. Militias were formed. Regular old white folks in Virginia were now militarized to go on slave patrols. And I'm not going to use the N-word here, but I'm going to use a gross and racialized term. And that you see this in the American South all the way through the 1960s. A white person sees a black person walking down the street, and it's a street where you don't usually see a black person. Hey, boy, what are you doing? This goes back to slave patrols. This goes back to, if you've watched the movie 12 Years a Slave, which is the best movie out there on American slavery, there's this scene where the main character is going between the plantation. He's sent on an errand to go from his plantation to another plantation. He bumps into this gang of white people. It's a horrifying scene. They're hanging somebody. They're lynching somebody. And they ask him for his pass. And if he didn't have his pass, he'd be lynched too. That's what it's a prison system. You are a prisoner if you have black skin. And you have to show to the white authorities, and it doesn't have to be the governor. It's just a regular old white redneck who's enforcing that system, calling you boy and wondering where you're going. These practices get embedded in our culture, and the dots connect across 400 years. Let me read a little bit else about this. This is an important part of this. After 1691, no Virginia planter could free slaves unless he paid for their transportation beyond the colony. Free blacks lost the right to bear arms, hold office, vote, or employ white servants. All of these things, this is in 1691, so this is 100 years before the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. New laws also promoted racial solidarity. This is the hugely important part of this, by all whites across class lines. In 1680, Virginia prescribed 30 lashes on the bare back of any black person who threatened or struck any white person. So if you're black and you hit a white person, you are in trouble. If you're white and hit a black person, that is what it is to be in an unfair system. This is with us today.
That's what they mean by systemic.
What's that?
That's what's meant by systemic racism.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. This is systemic. And the thing that, unless I'm missing something, I think we're all white people on this call right now. I mention that because there's a way in which our conversation is not as enriched as it would be if we had people here to share their experiences from the perspective of being a minority in America. but also it's important, I think, for white people to just understand this.
Yeah.
And this is why I want the entire class to end with listening. This does not mean that we are the guilty ones. I don't know if I want to kind of go there. I just want us to see this and to understand it. And so when we hear about Black people who are enraged at law and law enforcement, where does this come from? It comes from hundreds of years of law enforcement doing horrible things to people of color because of this assumption. This is why I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit. Why I was saying this about all of us being white people. It's important for us to realize the way, because we do not have the experience of being perceived as a racial minority in this country. But racial minorities are perceived as this assumption of criminality. This assumption that you need to be controlled, you need to be watched, you're about to do something bad. And white people in America don't really have that experience of being discriminated in that way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stuart.
What's that?
Thank you, Stuart.
Sure. Any other question that I'll try to answer more quickly than that one?
When did indentured servitude stop?
Not, it was still going on about 100 years later. A lot of Germans, so it was almost entirely English indentured servants in the 1600s. Then in the 1700s, more Germans sold themselves into indentured servitude and went to places like Pennsylvania. So we call it the Pennsylvania Dutch. It's actually the Pennsylvania Deutsch. And these very poor German, when you sell yourself into indentured servitude, you're not the top of the social heap wherever you're coming from. Nobody really does that unless you don't have a good option. But it continued on into the 1700s.
It was in existence when the Constitution was drafted.
I think it was, yeah.
Well, no, it was, but
yeah.
How much later did it last, do you know?
I don't. I'm sorry, I don't.
It strikes me that there's a fundamental difference for the indentured servant rather than the slave, in that there's an out for the indentured servant. If you survive, you've got something to look forward to.
Yeah.
Whereas with the slave, as you were saying for Barbados, every reason to rebel.
Yeah.
It seemed to be fundamental.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's the, that's the, something good about the system of, I mean, there's a way in which being a grad student is an indentured servant.
Yes.
I'm going to go and I'm going to pay my dues and, kiss up to it's an apprenticeship. And, I'm going to eat rice and beans for 7 years, but then after that I can become hopefully a professor one day. So there's this hope that's out in front of you, and you're working on something, and you'll get to live the good life later, no matter how tedious your life is. Exactly in enslavement, nothing is promised. Nothing is promised at all. And in addition to that, there's maybe the possibility of manumission, but although that was rare. And you're a slave, you're going to die a slave. And in addition to that, slavery is hereditary. Your children are going to be slaves. It's not hereditary in any racial biological sense, obviously, but in the system that came to exist in the United States, the children of slaves were slaves. It wasn't that way in some other forms of enslavement in some ancient cultures and cultures in other parts of the world, but it wasn't. Yeah, Todd, you were raising your hand.
No, I was just reaching something.
Oh no, Todd Johnson, were you raising
Todd.
your hand? Okay, I thought I saw you raise. Okay, well, on this cheery note, maybe. By the way, I think it's absolutely imperative to keep laughing. So I have a sense of humor that I hope never ends my career, although it probably will. The wrong joke at the wrong time. But
When you're really old, you'll realize you have to keep your sense of humor.
well, I guess maybe I'm really old already then.
No, you're not. You're not even.
Any other question anybody wants to ask? All right. Well, hey, thank y'all so much. I hope that hope you learned, got something out of it, and hope to see you.
Thank you so much.
Well,
Oh wow.
Stuart,
Okay.
Stuart. Oh,
All right.
before we log off tonight, we're going to close in prayer.
Yeah.
There's more unrest going on. I've just received news that there was a shooting in Louisville.
Mhm.
So let us stop and hold our country and hold us all in prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Lord God, we come before you this night. We raise up the pain that is surging through this country, this pain that goes back millennia, as we have learned this night. Lord, we ask that you would step in and transform hearts, that you would find those places where people can meet and come together, where voices can be heard, and truly be listened to. Lord, as we learn more of the history of the great sin that is slavery and racism in our country, that you would open our minds so that we might further in knowing how to love one another. We pray this in Christ's most holy name. Amen.
All right. Hey, thank you so much for organizing this.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you again, Stuart.
No, definitely.
Thank you.
All right. See you.
All right.
Good night to all.
Good night.
Night.